Okay, so today is Monday, April 6th, I think. So depending on when you watch this, obviously the date, the information I'm giving is going to be a little bit different. But as of today, my plan is to, in the next, today, maybe tomorrow, get a study guide up for you. And then we will have the exam posted next week. And then I'll give you a few days there to figure out when you're going to do it and actually take it. So just be thinking about that. Obviously be thinking again too about keeping up with not only these lectures, but also with the readings. There's one every week from here on out. So kind of make sure you're keeping up with all of that stuff. Now, the last chapter here before this exam that we're going to cover here is habitat. Right, and you probably have a sort of an idea what habitat is, what it means, but we do have a very, very specific definition of actually what it is. And that is an area with a combination of resources and environmental conditions that promotes residency by individuals of a species and allows them to survive and reproduce. Wow. Okay. Basically, we can distill that down to the simple idea that it's a place where animals can get all of the things they need, not only for them, but also to ensure the survival of the next generation, or in fact, actually, the fact that there will be another generation thereon. This is going to be different, obviously for every species, although a lot of species will have some pretty large overlaps between them. For example, small rodents all kind of require a lot of the same things. Cover small sort of hiding areas, escape zones, things like that are pretty standard, right? Of course, we'll do have some like woodland mice versus field mice and things like that be a little bit different. But generally speaking, there's enough overlap between a lot of species in an area that you can manage for multiple things at once. When we describe habitat, we need to kind of use what we're going to call qualifiers, right? What kind of a habitat are we actually having, right? So we can talk about, say, a breeding habitat or a foraging habitat. Where are they reproducing? Where are they looking for food? With the idea of suitable or unsuitable habitat, although you hear the terms a lot, are actually, they don't make any sense, right? Suitable habitat is redundant, right? Because the idea behind a habitat is that it's suitable. If it's not suitable, it's not habitat, right? And therefore, unsuitable habitat also is not something we're really gonna use. So let's try to get away from using that as an idea and stick here with just suitable, with just things like breeding habitat, foraging habitat, and understand that habitat is by definition suitable. It has to be, it's not habitat. Now, how do animals find habitat? The notion of habitat selection here is actually pretty complicated. They're going to use a variety of what we want to call environmental cues. Now, these cues can be direct, they can be indirect, but they're some indication of what a habitat might be usable for, or if it's not habitat at all. Okay. The ability to recognize cues, right, to understand that this area is habitat or this area is not, is something that is evolutionarily driven. Okay, so there is some heritability to that. And a part of the reason that can be so is that, again, when we talk about a species, they generally need the same thing. Every individual in a species generally needs the same thing. Although we will find that depending on where we're at, if we have a large range for the species, there may be some variability within that, right? If you have a range that includes both dry climates and wet climates, obviously habitat in a drier climate might require a source of standing water where a wet climate may or may not. Things like that. The cues we're looking for here will be things like food, nest sites, cover from predators. They can also be other animals, right? the presence of animals that might compete with them, the presence or absence of animals that might eat them, okay, all going to get into kinds of things that might make a habitat or not. One thing that we do see a lot is that the environment an animal grew up in, okay, can really strongly guide what cues they look for, right? So again, going back to our example of a species with a wide range, an animal that grows up in a dry climate, even if you pick it up and you transplant it to a wetter climate, they're still going to look, generally speaking, for the cues they were looking for in their youth habitat. So they'll still look for standing water or whatever, okay? When we have a resource that's missing or limited from a habitat, we call these limiting factors. Okay, so there are special kinds of cues that we might look for. And these cues themselves can be short-term, they can be seasonal, right? Or they can be long, year-round kinds of structures. We also can think about scale with these cues, right? They can be something that is going to be present over a broad area, or they can be what we call microsite. So within a habitat, an animal might look for, again, going back to the idea of standing water, right? What's around that standing water? Is there standing water with cover and escape zones, or is it standing water that's out in the open, right? Different animals might look for different things within those little microsites. We care about all of this, of course, because understanding these habitat selection behaviors, if we're going to manage for a species, we need to know what they want, right? What are they going to look for? What is going to be a successfully managed area? And if we're going to be putting things in, if we're going to be building things in here, this is really going to heavily rely on our understanding of what to build, what to put in, right? So things like artificial nests are good examples of that. Habitat quality, right? Again, we don't say suitable or unsuitable, but habitats can be really good or kind of crappy, right? They can be a habitat and not awesome, right? Or they can be a habitat that can be amazing, right? And one of the struggles for us in terms of assessing that is that quality is dynamic. It can change seasonally, it can change annually, it can change with the behavior of the animal, right? So at different times of year, an animal has different requirements for their habitat, right? And so what might have been a great habitat is now bad, or vice versa. And so in order for us to try to assess the quality of a habitat, we have to have kind of shorthand methods of doing that, right? And so one thing we're going to look for here is what we call demographic performance. We're going to look to see, okay, how are young of year doing? How are maturing individuals doing? And how are those demographic populations, how are the relative proportions of those populations changing from year to year, right? Are we have a relatively stable demographic, or are we seeing big demographic shifts, right? Are we seeing fewer and fewer young animals and more old animals, or vice versa? Okay, understanding those trends, right, can tell us a little bit about how the animals are utilizing the environment, are utilizing the habitat, and what things might be problematic in terms of that habitat for certain demographics. Now, with all of the models that we might ever use, this is always true, it's not simply just for habitat quality, but for just in general, they're going to vary in quality, right? And some of them are going to be good, some of them are going to be less good. And again, like with all things, some of them are going to be very good for certain scenarios, and some of them will be very poor for those same scenarios. But if you take them and put them in the right context, they can be useful. One thing that we need to kind of keep in mind here when we're trying to model habitat quality is that if we look at, just like the animals themselves can look at the environment for cues, we can do the same thing, right? So if we look at a landscape that's got maybe some patchiness to it, or zones of sort of we might perceive to be different qualities, we can look for the ones that have the most individuals in them. We can look for places that get occupied first, ones that are occupied year after year after year after year, right? Those are going to be places that are probably the highest quality. And if we look at those and compare them to some places that are maybe seasonally occupied or have relatively low density, or some years aren't occupied at all, we look at the difference between those two things, right? That can be an easy method for us to sort of assess what this particular species really ultimately needs to survive and to thrive, okay? And that's kind of getting at this last point here. It's an easy way for us to kind of cheat a little bit in terms of understanding what an animal needs. We're letting them tell us what they need rather than maybe us dictating what we think they need. An example of how this can be problematic is something we've talked about before, right? This notion of ecological traps. We talked about these before in the sense that they're places where an animal thinks they have what they need, right? But they're not sustainable environments, okay? And the trick before was that we don't ever want an ecological trap population sitting in an ecological trap to become a source, right? They can be sinks, and that's okay, but if the primary source of a species within a meta population becomes an ecological trap, that species is not long for the earth. So again, we need to understand maybe what some of these things are and kind of how we can avoid prioritizing them as a management thing. So a couple of things that can make a ecological trap here from the animal perspective. In both cases, the right cues are there, right? They think they have what they're looking for, right? But for a variety of reasons, it's not working out. The area itself doesn't lend itself to survival, right? This demographic performance, this idea that we're going to have a consistently large population of next year's adults, right? And that remains the same through year in and year out for different reasons, right? Maybe there's something in here that is preventing reproductive behavior, okay? Something in here that is sort of leading to poor survival of the individuals that live there. And one example of this might be if there are non-native plants there that are not meeting, say, the nutritional requirements for the animals, they're not meeting some behavioral cue for the animals, what have you. They might look like the right sort of thing in terms of structure, but they lack some particular characteristic that the species needs. Or, and this is harder to predict, all the cues are there, but a novel event occurs. And we talked about this example before when we talked about ground nesting birds, right? The idea that a bird might see a field and think, okay, all these field posts are there, that's great. I can keep a watch out from this spot. It can be the highest thing in the whole area. I can see anything coming. There's lots of great cover here for me to lay my nest in. Perfect. It's great until the combine comes around, or obviously alfalfa, we're not using the combine, but whatever the harvester is, comes around and tears up those nests. And now, obviously, there's no reproductive behavior there either. So again, ecological traps here are something that we need to be aware of, and we need to make sure that we're not promoting them through our management activities. Okay, so last thing for this video here, how do we characterize habitat, right? Again, the notion here, like everything we've ever said and everything I've ever said in this course, right, it's not as easy as it looks, right? In fact, it can be downright hard for some pretty unalterable reasons. Scale is a big one, right? How do we characterize habitat? Do we characterize the entire home range of the animal, of the species, of the population? Do we characterize certain zones within that habitat, like a breeding habitat or a foraging habitat? Does it change throughout the year? Obviously, for things like breeding habitat, it certainly does. Here, where we have distinct summer, winter, fall, spring seasons, temporal scales here, right? Again, even for foraging, right? Animals are going to eat different things at different times of the year. They're going to need different resources at different times of the year. So again, that's this sort of notion of scale here becomes an issue for us. Demographics, again, another big one. Depending on the animal, right? Young of year individuals, juvenile individuals might have profoundly different needs than the adults do, right? And so how do we, which of the things are we gonna characterize? How do we decide if we're gonna say, okay, this is a great habitat because it's good for the children, even if it's not great for the adults, right? Or vice versa. And so your challenge then, right, in terms of trying to characterize this habitat is, okay, what are a few key things, okay, that are related to population growth, right? We talked about this idea of demographics, right? Well, let's go back to it, right? Demographic performance, right? What's going to lead to a sustainable or even a sort of a enlarging population, right? Find those things, okay, manage for them, and that's the trick to it, right? That's really what it comes down to. So as you're putting this stuff together, right? Again, scale is always one of the most important things to get to, right? What is the area that you're looking at? What is the time that you're looking at? You can use what we call a hierarchical approach, right? Where you start, say, big spatial scales, long temporal scales, and work your way down to smaller and finer scales from there, right? Or vice versa, depending on the species in question. Right, so we can think about geographical distribution of the entire species, right? Kind of the big spatial scale, then to home range of an individual, right? Slightly smaller, and then down to patch choice within that home range, right? What areas of this home range do these animals spend the most time in? Okay. And again, thinking about things from this hierarchical approach can give you this kind of roadmap, right? Knowing what you're trying to do, research or management in this particular case, right? What those specific goals are, you can look at this hierarchy, think, okay, well, big scale, yes, medium scale, small scale, whatever, but picking the right scale for you. And once you've decided, at that point, I'm going to go ahead and sampling. So as always, right, we don't ever go do. We don't poll, right? We don't go out and we say, okay, we're going to measure every individual here and see what every individual is doing at every moment in time. We're taking some individuals, we're seeing what they're doing some of the time, right? And we're using that, right? We're making an estimate or an extrapolation based upon the small chunk of that population, the small chunk of time that we've got. And again, the subset here is going to be different depending on what your goals are. For trying to characterize habitat, right, we can go about it two different ways. Again, kind of going back to the idea before, we can look at, say, 1 or 2 or 20 individuals and see what they're doing, okay, where they're going and following the animals. Or we can sit down and say, okay, I'm going to look at this particular patch of land here, and I'm going to see what animals come in and what they're doing here and how long they're doing it. Right? And what we're doing is we're looking for use, right? Are animals in this particular plot of land, or what plots of land are animals in, depending on what our units are, and for how long, right? Are they here or are they not? Presence or absence? Are there a lot of them here, or are there only a few of them here, right? That's relative abundance. But again, just some mechanism to try to establish that animals are, in fact, utilizing this resource for something, okay? And within that, right, I'm trying to figure out, okay, well, what are animals using? What chunks of habitat are they using? We're looking for the vegetation. We're looking for the plants that are living there, right? Is it trees? Is it scrubland? Is it grassland? What kinds of grasses? What kinds of shrubs and scrub? Okay, that kind of stuff. Okay, so with this in mind then, we'll close this video out. We'll come back in the next video here. We'll finish it off with one more video. And we'll actually say, okay, how are we actually going to study some of this stuff? Okay.